Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us today for the virtual session 21, which is focused on discussing how the OECD DAC evaluation criteria can be applied in a national context. And I'm delighted to be joined today by two experts, Xin Xin Yang from UNICEF Country Office in China, as well as Velayuthan Sivagnanasothy, our leading expert and former ministry secretary from Sri Lanka. And they will be sharing with us today some of their experiences and observations of how the OECD DAC criteria, which were originally developed for international development cooperation, can actually be used, applied, and adapted to national development contexts. And as a feature part of our session today, we are also very excited to welcome George Moreira da Silva. He is the director of the Development Cooperation Directorate at the OECD, and he will be, together with our partners from MfDR and UNICEF, launching a brand new Chinese translation of the OECD criteria. If we could have the next slide, please, that we'll go ahead and get started. So I will give an introduction, and then we will do the launch of the Chinese criteria, and then we will go into the two presentations from our colleagues Xin Xin and Siva. Thank you again, and we're very glad to have you joining us. If you can use the chat function and the Q&A function, you can go ahead and ask questions, but we will leave some time for question and answers and discussion at the end of the three presentations. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, the focus of our discussion today is on the evaluation criteria of relevance, coherence, effectiveness, efficiency, impact, and sustainability. And together, these criteria help us define by what we mean by good sustainable development policies and programs. We use these criteria in evaluation to ask the right questions, to make sure that we're looking at the right aspects of an intervention when we're evaluating it. And each of these criteria provides us with a different lens, as we'll soon describe. As I mentioned earlier, though the criteria were originally developed for international development cooperation by the members of the OECD DAC, they are now widely used throughout the world, including in local and national development contexts. And this has been a demand-driven process, and you'll learn from our colleagues from Sri Lanka and China a little bit more about how they're using these criteria and using evaluation within their own national contexts. Next slide, please. I'll begin with an introduction to the evaluation criteria. My name is Kennedy-Chouane, and I head the evaluation unit within the Development Cooperation Directorate of the OECD. And I'll be presenting the recently launched evaluation criteria, which were adopted by the OECD DAC last year. Next slide, please. The first question is, what are these evaluation criteria? Many of the terms impact, effectiveness, efficiency are very familiar to those of us working in evaluation. But we don't often stop to think about what they actually are and how they're meant to be used. So a criteria is either a principle or a standard against which something is judged. And they are used to frame what is meant by a good intervention, whether that's a policy or a program. Next slide, please. Why do criteria matter? Now, this is an interesting quote from Thomas Pynchon, who said, "If they can get you asking the wrong questions, they don't have to worry about the answers." It's pointing to the fact that which questions we examine in evaluation are very important. We can spend a lot of time and resources answering questions that are not very interesting and which don't add much value in terms of improving our learning, helping us understand what works for whom and in which context. So the evaluation criteria are designed to focus our attention on understanding the intervention, the process of its implementation, and its results. The criteria help us look beyond the simple numbers of how much money is being spent, for example, what the inputs are, or what activities are being conducted, and to really understand the effects of an intervention. And that's why these criteria have become so widely used, because they present these basic concepts around understanding interventions and the effects that they're having on sustainable development. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, each criteria can be thought of as a lens. It's as with a camera, we look through this lens to look at the intervention and to understand it better, understand how it's being implemented in the context and what effects are happening, what results are being achieved. Next slide. By looking through each of these 6 different lenses, each of them providing a different perspective, a different way of understanding the intervention, we can have a clearer picture. Next slide. And with this more complete picture, we can provide better understanding to support learning and accountability. Next slide, please. I will now go through each of the 6 criteria and provide you with a bit of background around the meaning of each of the criteria. I would also invite you to go to oe.cd/criteria, where you can download a document that explains each of the definitions of the criteria and describes their meaning and their intended use. Those are all available on our website. So I won't go into a lot of detail today, but I will provide you with an overview of each of the 6 concepts and how they're meant to be applied. Staying on this slide, the first criteria is relevance. Is the intervention doing the right thing? And relevance is really about understanding the ways in which the intervention that you're evaluating is responding to the needs and the priorities of beneficiaries, partners, countries, and the global priorities. And so it's about understanding how the objectives and the design of the intervention, whether they're sensitive to the context, and whether they are addressing the meaningful needs and priorities of the stakeholders that are involved. An important aspect of relevance that we are emphasizing now is that relevance must be maintained if the context change. So needs and priorities may look quite different sometime after an intervention was designed, and evaluators need to examine the extent to which relevance was either improved or worsened by changes in the circumstance. Next slide, please. Coherence. While relevance focuses on the intervention and how it is related to the local context in which it's being implemented, coherence zooms out and looks at the compatibility of the intervention we are evaluating with other interventions in a country, sector, or institution. So that could mean, for example, for an organization like the OECD, the extent to which our work in education is coherent with our work on social policy. This also includes the extent to which an intervention either supports or undermines, or is supported or undermined by other interventions, including the international norms and standards to which an institution has subscribed. The coherence criteria is important, particularly in today's complex international development context, where you have many different actors often working on a variety of different policy agendas. We have climate change, we have health aspects, we have jobs and economic growth, we have social equality issues. All of these different perspectives involve various actors, and so it's important for evaluation to look at coherence as a way of understanding what progress is being achieved overall. Next slide, please. Effectiveness is perhaps the simplest criteria. It looks at the intervention and whether it is achieving its objectives. Are we doing what we set out to do? Effectiveness is also the most widely evaluated criteria, and we have defined it as the extent to which the intervention achieved or is expected to achieve its objectives and its results, including any differential results across groups. This involves the analysis taking into account the relative importance of the objectives or results. So in the case where we may achieve some of the intended objectives and some of them are not achieved, it's the job of an evaluator in drawing their conclusions to look at the relative importance of what has or has not been achieved and to weigh those up in assessing the overall success or not success of the intervention. We've also added in this new definition, which was adopted in 2019, the aspect of looking at differential results across groups. Now we know that despite the best of intentions, many programs and policies have unintended effects that are different across groups. For example, benefiting girls less than they benefit boys. And it's important that evaluators examine these issues of inequality and these differential effects so that we understand how these are interacting with inequality and with our shared objective in Agenda 2030 to leave no one behind. Next slide, please. Efficiency is about how well we use resources to achieve the results. It's the extent to which the intervention delivers or is likely to deliver results in an economic and timely way. So efficiency looks at, was this the best use of resources to achieve these goals? And it also looks at the operational efficiency, the timeliness and effectiveness of the implementation of an intervention. Next slide, please. Impact is the so what criteria. What difference is the intervention making? We have defined impact as the extent to which the intervention has generated or is expected to generate significant positive or negative, intended or unintended, higher level effects. Impact addresses the ultimate significance and potentially transformative effects of the intervention. It seeks to identify the social, environmental, and economic effects of the intervention that are longer term or broader in scope than those already captured under the effectiveness criterion. Now, the importance of impact is that we look beyond the objectives of the project or the program, the intervention that we're evaluating, and we looked at the ultimate significance. What difference does this make in somebody's life? How important is the result we've achieved relative to the size of the problem and the scope of the challenge we're attempting to address? The impact criteria is critical because we have seen too often that many evaluations looking through the lens of effectiveness find that projects are very effective. And yet overall, the macro picture in a country or in a context is not looking very good. And we know that we are off track on Agenda 2030. And we think that by evaluators focusing more on impact, focusing more on the higher level questions, we can really help drive the action on the Agenda 2030 to ensure that we're achieving our ultimate goals and achieving our longer term change. Thank you. Next slide. Sustainability. Sustainability looks at whether or not the benefits that we've achieved will last. It's the extent to which the net benefits of the intervention continue or are likely to continue. Now, we can look at sustainability, as with all of the criteria, at different points in time. We can even look at whether or not an intervention is likely to be sustainable before we have implemented it. So during the design stage, we can look to whether the intervention is designed in such a way that the benefits are likely to be sustained. And that includes looking at things like local ownership, capacities, and systems building, which are required to sustain benefits over the longer term. Next slide, please. As I just presented to you, these definitions outline the key concepts of these 6 different lenses that we use to look at interventions. One of the interesting things, however, in the process of reforming these criteria over the last 2 years was that many of the challenges we've heard about from our partners working in evaluation, but also working in strategic management and results-based management, is that there are a lot of challenges with how the criteria are applied. And that's why we've developed these 2 key principles to guide the use of these 6 criteria. The criteria should be applied thoughtfully to support high-quality, useful evaluation. They should be contextualized to the evaluation and to the context. And we should cover them according to the needs of the stakeholders. Now, the need for local adaptation and contextualization of these criteria is one of the reasons that we have decided to take a partnership-based approach to rolling out the criteria. And we are now working with partners around the world to develop different language adaptations of the criteria documents, which, as I mentioned, is available at oe.cd/criteria. We have the document currently available in French and English. We are also working with other colleagues on Arabic, Thai, and Spanish and Portuguese translations. Now I would like to turn it over to Mr. Jorge Moreira da Silva. Next slide, please. Who is the Director of the Development Cooperation Directorate. And he is going to share with us the exciting news about a very currently relevant adaptation of the Better Criteria document into Chinese language that we are launching today together with our partners from AFDI and from UNICEF. Over to you, George.
Thank you, Megan. And first of all, I would like to thank this opportunity to join the Asian Development Evaluation Week. Again, I joined in 2018 in Chengdu. Unfortunately, this time is virtual, but I'd like to congratulate the organizers for keeping the event and organizing this virtually in a very smooth and effective manner. And I welcome this opportunity to join the session and using this opportunity and applying evaluation criteria in local contexts, but also, as Megan mentioned, to launch the Chinese language version of better criteria for better evaluation. Let me emphasize the importance of engaging with China as a key partner of the OECD and with Asian partners on development cooperation, policies and systems. Our engagement helps build mutual learning and two-way information exchange with a view of influence and be influenced. Let me share my appreciation also for the engagement and contributions of UNICEF and the Asia Pacific Finance and Development Institute, whose partnership with OECD was key to this high quality translation. And I'd like to thank UNICEF in particular for the leadership taken carrying out the initial translation. Producing the translation was an opportunity to build new collaborative working relationship. This is a good example to highlight that over the years we have created trust with partners in Asia and look forward to further strengthening this in the future. The criteria, as Megan mentioned, are being used in a range of different contexts, from evaluation, international cooperation activities, to interventions of national or local governments in domestic policy context. So it's becoming a global public good. The Sustainable Development Goals call for new ways of thinking. They demand that we move away from donor-recipient relationships and instead recognize that all partners have something to learn from each other. Working together through these collaborative partnerships between different development actors is critical to achieve sustainable development that is in the interest of all, especially taking consideration that we are off track on the implementation of the 2030 agenda. I look forward to the valuable presentations by the panelists on how the criteria have been applied in China and Sri Lanka, and the rest of the discussion. I invite partners from other countries to work with us in adapting the criteria to their own context. Thank you.
Thank you so much, George. And colleagues, you can see on the screen now the link to the website where you can now download the Chinese version of the criteria. Thank you so much for joining us, George, and thank you to the partners who were involved. And now turning to one of the partners that was critical to this translation, Xin Xin Yang is a multi-country evaluation specialist working with UNICEF in the China country office. And she will be sharing with us some insights on the evolution of development evaluation in China. Over to you, Xin Xin. Thank you.
Many thanks, Megan and George. Hello, everyone. My presentation will examine the development of evaluation in China as a case study to show how domestic reform in China and its own foreign aid to other developing countries might affect each other in the process of adopting international evaluation criteria. This presentation is based on one of my research papers on the subject. As we know, the notion of development evaluation has changed along with the notion of development itself. As development, as mentioned, as Megan and George have mentioned, development is no longer supply-driven or project-based. Since the late 1990s, evaluation has been seen as a component of a public sector development and civil service reform in developing countries. There has been a growing awareness that strong national and sector M&E systems are necessary to assess efforts to reduce poverty and to demonstrate results in SDG. There has been an increasing interface between donor agencies M&E in their aid practice and the developing countries' pursuit of result-based management, RBM, in their own public sector reform. At the same time, national evaluation capacity development has become recognized as a mechanism for strengthening the responsiveness of public management systems to both internal and external demands for transparency, effectiveness, and result orientation. Next slide, please. Oh, actually, next slide. I just talked about this one. Okay. In the past 3 decades, different driving forces have transformed the evaluation landscape in China. Here, I want to talk about three different models that the international community has employed to build the M&E capacity in China. That is the systematic approach used by ADB, the sector approach used by IDRC, and the country-led evaluation approach used by the Dutch government, as you can see on the slide. In the early 1990s, by request from the Chinese government, ADB conducted careful needs assessment in China. Since 1994, ADB provided several TAs on result-based M&E to the key central government agencies of China. These TA projects sensitized the officials of the importance of project performance evaluation as a management and planning tool. It provided a global perspective and facilitated the learning of new ideas and concepts in evaluation. During the same time period, China saw the rapid growth of a few government-sponsored evaluation organizations. For example, in 1994, the Ministry of Science and Technology set up the National Center for Science and Technology Evaluation. And in 2004, the Ministry of Education established the Higher Education Evaluation Center. These new evaluation agencies and their host line ministries have been very keen on developing capacity in policy evaluation through engaging international participants in the design and implementation of their performance management system. I can give you an example. In 2009, Chinese Ministry of Health approached the IDRC, a Canadian Crown corporation, for a TA project with 2 interlinked components. One is the capacity building in health evaluation, and the other one is to develop a health indicator system for Health China 2020. The activities carried out under this TA included conducting policy evaluation workshops, initiating an international visiting scholar program to host Chinese researchers and policymakers at IDRC and research institutions in Canada, as well as developing a conceptual framework for an M&E indicator system. So these 2 examples give you showing how the international community can provide concrete technical assistance. In addition to that, the donor community has conducted some cutting-edge practice in capacity building. The Policy and Operations Evaluation Department, IOB, of the Dutch government and the China National Center for Science and Technology Evaluation initiated a first-generation country-led independent evaluation in 2005 for a development program funded by the Dutch government in China. Under this initiative, both partners shared responsibility for the overall process. It is believed that the joint character of the exercise itself and the publication of a joint report encouraged the dissemination of the evaluation result. Next slide, please. So, these international TA activities laid a good foundation for M&E capacity building at the central government level in China. International experience shows that laws and regulations are a necessary part of the incentive framework that could further nurture the broader nationwide demand for evaluation. In China, the Ministry of Finance is the leading agency in further institutionalizing such demand through developing regulations and policies in 2 areas: performance budgeting and evaluation of projects funded by international financial institutions, the IFIs. As several sessions at this AEW focus on the performance-based budget management in China, here I will mainly talk about how the MoF, the Ministry of Finance, has introduced international criteria in evaluating IFI-funded projects in China. In 2008, the MoF issued the interim measures for the administration of the performance evaluation of the loan projects of international financial organizations. I want to highlight that this document clearly defines performance evaluation in this Chinese context as the objective, scientific, and impartial evaluation of the policy relevance, efficiency, effectiveness, impact, and sustainability of projects through certain evaluation standards, indicators, and methods. This definition clearly shows the influence of international norms as it is compatible with the OECD DAC criteria. In 2013, based on the feedback from the pilot evaluation experience, the MoF published and distributed the official administrative measures on the performance evaluation of loans and grants projects of international financial institutions. We should also know that in the past 20 years, due to the rapid growth of its economy and international influence, China has come to be considered as a knowledge center for development by many other developing countries. Both ADB and World Bank chose the MfDR in Shanghai, which is also the co-organizer of the Asian Evaluation Week, as their regional partner in East Asia for their programs to strengthen developing countries' capacity for M&E. Since 2011, China has been the host country of the East Asia Regional Center for Learning on Evaluation and Result, CLEAR in short, which is a multi-donor funded global initiative administered by the World Bank. Programs like CLEAR sustained the momentum created by previous international TA on promoting result-based M&E in the Chinese public sector. Not only has the past 20 years witnessed China's transformation from a knowledge consumer to a knowledge producer in international development, it has also seen China grow from an aid recipient to an aid provider. As the aid scale expands, China is becoming more concerned about aid quality. Thus, improving evaluation system and developing evaluation capacity are becoming important items on China's foreign aid agenda. Again, MoF is proactive in developing a system to evaluate China's contribution to the IFS. For example, the People's Republic of China Poverty Reduction and Regional Cooperation Fund was established in March 2005 under the ADB. Similarly, China has contributed to several multi-donor trust funds at the World Bank. The Chinese government has conducted a comparative study on how to evaluate the performance of China's IFI administered funds by researching how similar ADB and World Bank funds, especially single donor trust fund, are evaluated by both the IFIs and the donor countries. Eventually, MoF will develop an evaluation framework to regulate when and how to select projects to be evaluated, and what processes and criteria to follow for the performance evaluation of these China funds. Given that these China funds are administered by the major IFS, it's expected that China's own evaluation framework wouldn't be in substantial conflict with those of the IFS. In summary, the development of evaluation in China provides a good angle and case study to examine the shift of China's role from an aid recipient to an aid provider, and from a knowledge consumer to a knowledge producer. In the past, China has established itself as an active, strategic, and selective partner in adopting good international practice to serve its domestic development goals. The world would expect to see the same pattern when it comes to how China establishes a system to manage and evaluate its foreign aid. At the same time, any exposure to good practice that China gets from its participation in international cooperation may be reflected in its approach to domestic development. traditional donors can still contribute to both domains, and they can continue their technical assistance to help China meet its different domestic needs on M&E capacity building. Meanwhile, on the international stage, many donors have chosen to engage in China-led initiatives, which creates a real potential of these initiatives to reflect the needs of developing countries and international good practice to meet these needs. So due to time constraint, let me stop here, and I will be happy to take your questions during the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Xin Xin. And I see we already have some of our participants using the Q&A function. Please do go ahead and put your questions there so we can come back to them, and we will open it up for discussion of all three presentations. I'd now like to turn to my colleague Siva, who is a senior consultant on evaluation and former secretary within the Ministry of National Policies and Economic Affairs. And Siva is going to present us with a much more detailed and technical description of how the evaluation criteria have been applied to a particular development project within Sri Lanka, and will describe sort of the relationship between the national evaluation and the global development goals. And we will spend about 15 to 20 minutes on Siva's presentation, and then we will open it up. Go ahead, Siva.
Thank you, Megan. And this presentation is on Sri Lankan case study application on OECD DAC evaluation criteria. Next, please. This presentation basically, next one, focuses on using the evaluation criteria, especially in a national context where country-owned, country-led evaluations are today becoming more and more important. In the old days, the donor-funded, donor-centric evaluations, subsequently it changed towards joint and collaborative evaluations. Subsequently, with the development, it changed towards country-based, country-led evaluations, and countries have started to institutionalize and mainstream development evaluation in their own countries. And Sri Lanka has its own evaluation, which started with post-project evaluation in early 90s with the support of the ADB, and subsequently with the UNDP, we were able to expand it for country-led ongoing and ex-post and impact evaluations. And now with the USAID, we are getting supported to develop practitioners' guide on development evaluation and managing for development results. I think the OECD DAC criteria has helped countries to focus on structuring the evaluation questions, which is very important. The DAC criteria goes beyond input-output thinking towards outcomes and results. And the DAC criteria, the relevance, efficiency, effectiveness, impact, and sustainability, which was prior in 1991, was basically used as a first step to design the right evaluation question. If somebody wants to design a right key evaluation questions, they may have to go by the criteria, which are widely used by partner countries, by donors, by development partners, INGOs, and also Sri Lankan government also, the practitioners guideline already incorporates the DAC evaluation criteria. And today we have included the big six, not the big five, which was already earlier there, but the big six criteria basically focuses on relevance, coherence, efficiency, effectiveness, impact, sustainability. And these aspects have been built into the evaluation process, because to look at the evaluation in a more holistic and balanced manner. And it is not imposed. It is used as a gold standard because to cover up the wider perspective with a wider lens. Therefore, it is not imposed, but picked up by many countries, many actors, and sometimes not all criteria are selected. Sometimes we select out of the 6 criteria, maybe 2 or 3 criteria, and formulate evaluation questions and do our evaluation design metrics, which is a planning process for evaluation, and we undertake the evaluation. Next slide, please. When it comes to evaluation, I think as discussed by me, in 1991, the big 5, relevance, efficiency, effectiveness, impact, and sustainability, Those 5 criteria were there, widely used as gold standards, widely adopted. But 2015 Sustainable Development Goals era has made a bigger change in the development definition, changing the landscape of development with 2030 Development Agenda. 2030 Development Agenda has made a big change in a sense that development is no more a wealth creation exercise, something like those Adam Smith, father of the economics, who said creating wealth is important and the division of labor is important, where the dignity of labor doesn't matter. Whether the monotonous work is carried out by people, it is all right, provided the wealth is created. That definition has today gone out, and we are in a new era where development is widely seen not as a wealth creation activity, but more of a shift in the norms and values, where principles of no one left behind, inclusivity, gender, and also persons with disabilities are included, have to be included into development. And the focus on equity, the focus on human rights, the focus on peace, the focus on governance, and also the focus on justice. And then the focus also is on climate change and environment. So the development definition, unlike very good old days of wealth creation, has completely shifted towards looking at a human angle from a humanitarian perspective, the human development side of it. The rights-based approach to development is coming to more focus with the SDGs. And also the development era, 2015 SDG era, also recognizes complexity, where interdependencies, linkages, trade-offs, synergies, and partnerships are recognized. And it is important because when you try to achieve one goal, maybe you may have to forego the other goal. Say, for example, if you try to look for economic growth, sometimes you may have to forego equity. Sometimes when you try to focus on maybe high economic growth, environment has to be sometimes sacrificed. So you need to look at those trade-offs and make sure that there is synergies, there are interlinkages, and also whatever the programs that we implement is also complemented by the other programs, which will make it a synergy, a more harmonized approach to development to achieve. So therefore, the SDG context, shifting the norms and values, and also the complexities and looking into those complexities have made our definition of development completely changed. And today we have the big 6 criteria, which is relevance, coherence, efficiency, effectiveness, impact, which captures the change in the definition on one side, and also which captures the new criteria on coherence. And it builds in the new perspective of development and trying to evaluate projects, evaluate the performance of projects, what works, what does not work, why it works, and why it does not work. The perspectives are looked from a more holistic and a balanced approach with the latest modern thinking on development. Next slide, please. Let me now go into the explaining the use of that criteria in a Sri Lankan context. We have one of the important projects that I would like to take up, because this is a case study presentation. We have the local empowerment through economic development. It was a very important program of Sri Lanka. The local empowerment through economic development is called LEAD Plus, and it is basically a project which is mainly to improve livelihood, reduce poverty in conflict affected areas, very importantly the conflict affected areas, and by supporting the small producers. When I say small producers, it may be fruit producers, vegetable producers, and fisheries sector producers. So those fishermen are also taken into consideration, and those are high potential sectors identified through an assessment process. And this project is trying to support the small producers and thereby improve the production and productivity, and thereby help the livelihood opportunities, poverty reduction to the conflict affected communities through what we call it inclusive approach, where women headed families and persons with disabilities, because due to conflict we had large number of women-headed families in the north, and also we had persons with disabilities. They were to be included into the development process by building value chains. When I say value chains, the southern factories, southern investors have to come and invest in the northern part and put up processing factories, not just exporting or producing raw vegetables, raw material, raw fish products, raw vegetables and fruits, but to process it in the same location in the northern province, so that there will be additional value addition, and that value addition will create employment opportunities to the vulnerable groups, especially the women, and also especially the people who are with disabilities, persons with disabilities, which we may call it PWD. So this project concept.
Thank you, Siva. And I know that there's quite a bit of detail on the LEED Plus program on the slide. So if we could maybe move to the next section, please.
So this project basically, as I told you, looks at the supporting the small producers, organizing small producers through cooperative societies, and building collective working arrangements, and also, next slide please, and also bringing private investment from the southern part, and value addition, and ensuring that the the weak groups, women, and also the persons with disabilities are employed in this process. Next slide please, next slide. And the inclusive approach is adopted in the whole program. So this project basically, next slide, looks at the SDG goals, all major goals. Say goal number 1, poverty, no poverty, and goal number 5, gender equality is also given emphasis. Decent work and economic growth is also given emphasis. Reducing inequalities are also emphasized. And then the peace building, because this is a conflict addressing project, and also the partnership approach of bringing private sector people into the business, and then linking the southern private business with the northern small producers, and value chain development. These are basically considered in the whole LEADS program. Now let's go to the next area. So the LEADS is a comprehensive project, next one please, which basically looks at, if you look at the theory of change, it articulates the links between activities, inputs and activities from the left side to the outputs, outcomes, and finally the impact. Impact is mainly focusing on improving the sustainable income generation for the conflict affected people, including women and persons with disabilities. And through that, you try to build business linkages and make it a peaceful society and harmonized society where northern community and the southern community work together in collaboration towards peace building process. Next slide, please. Now let's look at the application of OECD DAC criteria, which is formulating the right key evaluation questions. One has to formulate the right key evaluation questions. So the first question, first area of focus according to a DAC criteria is the relevance. Is the intervention doing the right thing? When we call it relevance, whether the project logic and the theory of change respond to the expectations of the beneficiaries, whether the project is focusing on the expectations of the beneficiaries, especially the conflict affected communities, and whether the project is aligned to the National Development Plan, the SDG goals, and also the decent work program. So the alignment and the prioritization of the project towards the beneficiaries is one of the important areas that we would like to focus when it comes to the relevance. When it comes to the relevance also, it is important to look at whether the project objectives are realistic, and whether the theory of change is valid, whether the intervention logic is valid, and whether the indicators used and the assumptions identified are all valid to make the project a more successful, results-oriented project. So that is also an important area. So I would like to go to the next slide, because I may not want to address all the questions. When it comes to coherence, I think we need to look at how well does the intervention fit. Here we are concerned about the coherence part, which is basically achieving one goal and how the other goals will get affected. If you try to achieve one SDG goal and if it has an impact on the other goal, growth versus equity or growth versus environment, mechanization versus employment, I think those are important concerns. When it comes to LEAD project, we are trying to attract the private sector from the south to come to the north and put up factories there, processing centers and factories there. Those companies are profit-oriented companies. So whether we will be able to attract those profit-oriented companies, how successful we are when they are on a right-based principle, because we are asking those companies to employ women and also persons with disabilities, persons who have been affected by conflict. They must employ those people, and how far the rights-based approach and the profit-focused private sector will mobilize when it comes to the northern community where the conflict is there. Whether if they come and invest the money, they are coming with the intention of making the profit. But what about the rights? Will they recognize the rights? Will they be happy and comfortable to work on a rights-based approach while focusing on their profits and profitability? That may be an evaluative question. So the evaluation, second question may be to see whether the LEAD projects or LEAD Plus has considered the international labor standards, whether the human rights aspects are considered, whether the rights of the disabilities are considered, whether affirmative actions are taken to support women with separate women toilets, or maybe with access to the buildings and factories to the persons with disabilities, those disabled people, those conflict affected people. There must be some additional investment to access, enable them to access the buildings and also give them additional support. So is that possible and feasible? How the project is helping them to put that across? So these are some of the questions for coherence. Next slide, please. When it comes to efficiency, I'm not going to too much deal with efficiency because it is, we are all very familiar with efficiency. When it comes to efficiency, we are concerned with the work plan, whether the work plan can be delivered within time, within cost, in a cost-effective manner. Here we are concerned about cost effectiveness. We are trying to also look at the other alternative options, and we are also looking at the monetary cost and also the non-monetary cost. When I say non-monetary cost, when you are looking at alternatives, you have to always see the social and environmental cost also according to the new DAC criteria. So therefore, whether the project implementation arrangements are smart enough with the skills, capacities, equipments, and strength to deliver those work plans in an efficient and effective manner. Those are evaluative questions on efficiency. Next slide, please. When it comes to effectiveness, is the intervention achieving the objectives? Objectives are important. We are more concerned about production, whether the LEAD Plus project will be able to increase the production, increase the yield, increase the value chain development. They have to finally make sure that the processing factories are coming up, and the investment mobilization. The investors from the south are coming and putting those factories and mobilizing their funds, and whether those access to decent work for women and persons with disabilities are also there. I think we have to make sure those outcomes are clearly achieved. If those outcomes are not tangible and visible, then the project may not be achieving the expected outcome, or we may call it effectiveness in terms of that. So let me go to the next slide, please. When it comes to impact, we are worried about the difference the intervention is making, the long-term results. How far the intervention, the evaluation question, key evaluation question here is how far the LEAD Plus intervention has generated high impact on poverty reduction, empowerment, women empowerment, and also empowerment of PWDs, and in terms of economic empowerment as well as decision-making empowerment, also and also reconciliation. How far the project has addressed those things. The so what question, the long-term results, long-term impact aspect of it is being examined through the impact evaluation, and it captures the intended, unintended, positive, negative impacts and all it will capture basically. So let me go to the next slide, please. Next area of focus is on sustainability. Will the benefit last? After the lead project withdraws the support, for external assistance is withdrawn, will the project be able to sustain the results? Will they be able to continue their operations? Here, what is important question is, in the key evaluation question is, whether the lead plus principles, have they been institutionalized and replicated in other development programs funded by the other sources, maybe the government sources and other sources. If it is replicated, then we can be happy with the project, that this project has planted a seed to make sure that the lead plus project principles are applied widely in all other development interventions, and it will complement and make sure that the sustainability of the intervention is there. So the key evaluation questions, next slide please, are very important when it comes to evaluation, because we have to go by the evaluation criteria. The big six criteria are very important because they give a big perspective of the development definition. And are we looking development from a wealth creation angle, or are we looking at development from a human rights, equity, peace building, and also from a wider perspective? That is also equally important. So here the evaluation design matrix is being developed after the evaluation questions. Basically, the design matrix is a planning tool, a management tool for the evaluation, a planning and design tool, I may call it, because it identifies the DAC criteria. Under each criteria, it tries to define the key evaluation questions, which we call it KEQs, key evaluation questions. And then the questions will have to be answered through a key performance indicators. The indicators will show whether have we answered those questions and what type of data sources are available to collect those information, and what type of data collection methodologies are used for collecting the data. This gives the framework. And when it comes to the lead, the relevance area, the lead plus program, is it aligned to the national development plan, or is it meeting the needs of the beneficiaries? This is one of the important questions we have under relevance. The key evaluation questions from a country perspective, from a national perspective, we are concerned whether the program is aligned to the national development plan, whether the program meets the requirements of the community, that is conflict affected communities, the beneficiaries. Here the degree of alignment is important, how far the alignment is there, the percentage wise. So therefore we need to look at the national development plan, SDGs, these are data sources, and also the project appraisal report, and also the data collection methods, maybe basically desk review, key informant interviews. We can interview with the policymakers, with the planners, with the development managers to see whether the program is aligned to the development plan, whether the SDG, is it aligned to the SDGs, and we can ask the communities, go to the conflict affected communities and ask whether these projects and programs are meeting your expectation. We can always have consultation with those through a focus group discussions and other processes, and percentage of beneficiaries who say that the needs are met by the lead projects. The lead project, if 80-90% of the beneficiaries say that the lead project has met their requirements and beneficiaries, the performance indicator is appropriate, and the data sources and the data collection method is also valid. So authentic source of data is important, and also proper collection of data collection method is important. Evidence-based information is important. So that is why this design matrix is developed. Next area, please. Next slide. When it comes to relevance, also the theory is also very important. Whether the theory of change has been articulated well, whether the intervention logic is smart, whether the project activities and outputs, are they relevant to the outcomes and objectives? Are we included any irrelevant components? Have we excluded any important components? I think these are, we have to ask through KPIs. The KPIs may be whether the well-articulated logic, or whether all problems are being addressed. And this is through a perception survey, and the data sources are set out in the design matrix, and the data collection methods are set out. So it's an evidence-based decision-making process where the evaluation design matrix conveys us the whole framework. And next, please, next slide. I may have to rush this because the limitation of time. Coherence is also very important. How well does the intervention fit? Here, whether the under the LEAD Plus project, whether the commercially oriented, profit-focused private companies, which are in the southern part of the country, whether are we able to attract them to the north to put up the processing factories, although they are profit-oriented, whether are they willing to come and serve the north on a right-based approach where they will employ women and also whether they will employ the persons with disabilities and make sure the reconciliation process is supported. So therefore, coherence in that context is important. You can have some key performance indicators to assess the coherence part. The number of private companies attracted under the LEAD Plus principles and the MOU signed, the value of private investments mobilized will be an indicator, and also how much affirmative action investments have taken place, how many amount, what amount of money the project has spent on supporting women to enable them to enter into the working arrangement, like women toilets, like supporting disabled with access to those facilities. So let's go to the next slide.
Thank you, Siva. I know we have quite a few more slides for the evaluation design matrix for the other criteria. I think since you've described quite some detail, the coherence and relevance, perhaps we could skip ahead through the other 4 criteria without going into the detail, and we will share the slides afterwards so others can take a look at the design matrix. If we could maybe skip ahead to
from the evaluation design matrix, the questions are important, the criteria is important, the question is important, the key performance indicators will be very important. The source of collecting the data, it has to be authentic, credible, valid, and also the data collection method is also important, whether we are getting the data from desk review or are we getting from focus group discussions, community interviews, or even from other direct observations. Let us go to the next slide, please. Next one. So I think impact, sustainability, these are all related ones. Where sustainability is concerned, we are worried whether the LEAD project, after the withdrawal of the support by the Australian and the Norwegian government, will these projects get institutionalized? Will those principles get replicated? Will those principles get embedded into the new projects and programs that the government is implementing and other donors are implementing? So the buy-in is important, and the adoption of the LEAD principles are also quite important. And this source of data and the data collection methods are there. We'll go to the next slide, please. So the design matrix completely gives up a full picture. So if we summarize this, we are taking the evaluation criteria as a fundamental base, the big 6 criteria based on the new development definition, where development is not wealth creation, but in a broader, bigger picture of development under SDG era, the development definition and the criteria are 6 big criteria: relevance, coherence, efficiency, effectiveness, impact, sustainability. Evaluation questions have to be addressed, and the indicators are very important to measure the performance. And then what we, Sri Lanka and other countries do is they do the scoring based on the judgment, and then finally they rate the project, whether the project is highly successful, partly successful, successful or unsuccessful, and the rating is done. And finally, the evaluation questions will finally help, the DAC criteria and evaluation questions will finally help to get the key issues, lessons learned, follow-up actions and recommendations, which will be finally fed into the management response, which is very important, because end of the day, we are all worried about implementing the findings, the dissemination of the findings. The findings will have to be linked to the planning process, the budgeting process, the program management process. So therefore, when you develop a new project, the management response, the improvement plans are very fundamental and important, and the evaluation should try to improve. One is accountability for learning, accountability aspect for results, and the second one is learning for the future, and the third aspect is to do a mid-course correction. If you want to improve your project, the mid-course corrections will have to also be done. And through that process, you finally make sure that evaluation gets embedded.
Thank you. Let's go ahead and wrap up so we have a bit of time for questions. Thank you so much.
Appreciate. Thank you, and sorry for
it
was a big case study. I'm
the,
sorry it cannot be explained within a short period, so I have taken a case study. And sorry about my little going fast. Sometimes some might have missed the briefing also. So despite that, I think I tried my best to give a briefing. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I think it was very useful, Siva, and indeed there's a lot of rich material. The PowerPoint will be available afterwards, so you're welcome to download the PowerPoint and look in more detail at each of the evaluation matrices. I would like to start with one of the questions from the audience that is directed towards, I believe it's directed towards you, Siva, but I think also others can respond. So the question is about, how do we handle the conflict between developing locally significant evaluation criteria and having comparable indicators when it comes to comparing across interventions? And just one point from my perspective in terms of how the evaluation criteria are meant to be used. For me, one key issue around comparability is that we don't look at different issues under different criteria in a different context. So for example, the question of whether or not we have achieved our objectives is always answered under effectiveness. We should not be looking at that question under relevance, for example. So having this conceptual clarity about what each criteria means is really critical. And then the way in which we go about looking at the objectives and the way the depth, for example, that we go into in looking at the differential results under effectiveness, that might vary depending on the context, whether or not the differential results that are occurring are significant, for example. So there is some variation and some adaptation, but nonetheless, the conceptual clarity around each criteria and what it means should allow for a good level of comparability. But that's my perspective. Siva, would you like to address Roland's question about how do you handle the conflict between developing locally significant criteria and the issues of indicators for comparability when comparing across different interventions in different regions? Please go ahead.
As discussed in my earlier presentations, the evaluation criteria, the big 6 criteria are giving a big picture of the development. So if we try to look at the big picture, we will not be misled in a sense that we will not omit anything, because we will be looking the whole thing in a holistic and balanced perspective. If we don't have a criteria, if we assume under no intervention scenario, no criteria scenario, you will be sometimes compelled to ask questions on a certain segment only. Maybe you may ask about 10 evaluation or 6 evaluation questions on maybe relevance, but you may overlook the sustainability. You may overlook the coherence aspects. I think therefore this evaluation question sets out the foundation for asking the right question, but the questions will vary depending on the theory of change, the logic of the intervention, and also the stakeholders' requirements, the policy makers with whom we have a stakeholder consultation workshop. We call it a scoping session. At the scoping session, sometimes the policymakers may come out and ask for relevant questions. This is what we want to know from this project. This is what we would like to hear on this project. So those evaluative questions can come from stakeholders, but they have to be, when they are grouped under a DPRK criteria, we know whether are we balanced or are we overly one-sided and skewed, or is it a balanced questionnaire that helps in a big way to make sure that our evaluation questions are meaningful and outcome focused and results oriented. I think that perspective is important.
Excellent, thank you. And I would like to turn now to a broader question from Hyun Song. How to evaluate the extent to which national policies are relevant or coherent to global goals like SDGs, considering that a country, for example, China or Sri Lanka, will have its own priority development needs and frameworks. And this, in my mind, is a very interesting question. I saw yesterday, in fact, a presentation of a synthesis of nearly 600 evaluations in Afghanistan. And there was not a single evaluation that determined that the intervention was not relevant. which is kind of interesting when you look at, what does it mean to actually be relevant in a specific country or in relation to global goals. Xin Xin, could you perhaps give your insights on that perspective of how do we look at the different priorities and potentially that there may be conflicts or different views on what actually the priorities should be between a national plan and the international partners?
Well, first, I think it has been a common practice when the development partners design their program or intervention in a particular country, in a specific country, consultation and needs assessment has to be integral part of the design process of the intervention. So this is the opportunity for the development partners to understand the needs of local country, not only at the national level, but also at the local level, especially where the pilot projects will be carried out. So in that sense, some mechanism or consensus are already there to ensure the relevance of the intervention with the national priority policy and with the target provinces or locality and the end beneficiaries. So the problems we have seen in designing and implementing such interventions is sometimes this assessment process cannot go down to reach the local level, especially the beneficiaries or the local government, to design some interventions to target their needs. So, and only the central government sometimes speak on behalf of the needs of other, local government or target people. So that is something could be missing, yeah.
Yeah, great. So let's take another question now. There's a question from KJ Lim. The SDGs are highly integrated and interrelated. What is your view on integration to be included as an additional criteria? Siva, would you like to address this question of the interrelation of the SDGs and how that's addressed through the criteria?
SDGs are already looked the development from a very broader and a balanced perspective, covering the rights approach as well as the developmental approach. So therefore, SDG gives a comprehensive framework for the new development definition. Today when we say development, we are more concerned about if a company which is producing a certain product, if they try to increase their productivity and if they try to undermine the labor, that productivity improvement cannot be considered as a good sign in terms of SDGs because it undermines the dignity of labor. So therefore, the SDG framework has given an excellent and a wider perspective of development from different perspectives, ranging from growth to equity to decent work to labor standards to equity and various dimensions. So therefore, I see there is a very close collaboration between the new definition of development and also the new DAC criteria, which is the Big Six. In the Big Six, what as the OECD done is basically they have changed the definition. So definitional change has captured all dimensions of SDG expectations. Similarly, the coherence part also is brought into that. So through coherence, the uncertainty and all those aspects, the interlinkages, the synergies, all those aspects are also brought in. So therefore, the new criteria, the new DAC criteria basically covers the change in the development definition and also captures the new areas of coherence, which makes it more aligned, almost I would say 100% to the SDG expectation. So therefore, SDGs are well taken care under the new DAC criteria, OECD DAC criteria. That is my Sri Lankan perspective.
Yes, excellent. Thank you, Siva. And I see we have a question from Mr. Ba, who would love to see an example of one of your reports to report on this type of evaluation. We've provided a link to the DAC Evaluation Resource Center, which is a library of an online library of evaluation reports. But Siva, if you had other examples of country evaluations from Sri Lanka, please do share a link or make those available, because I think Mr. Ba and others would be very interested to receive those. I'd now like to turn to the question of the national integration of the evaluation criteria. There's a question: to what extent have the 6 evaluation criteria been included in the national laws and regulations on M&E of public policies and programs in China and Sri Lanka? The 6 criteria are relatively new, so I think the process of integration is ongoing. They were first approved in December of last year, so they're still being integrated, including within OECD member countries. But it's interesting in the context of Asia Evaluation Week to see that actually in the Asia Pacific region is one of the areas where there has been the greatest level of integration of the evaluation criteria into national regulations and policies. We also know a number of our partners, including in Sri Lanka, have developed specific tools and guidance, such as a practitioner's guidance for using the criteria within their national context or within their institutional context. And at the OECD, we are currently developing a new guidance, which will be out later this year, that will help guide the use and the operationalization of these criteria into local contexts. Now, I know, for example, that in the Philippines, the criteria are specifically mentioned within their national mandate on conducting evaluation of public policies. That's one example. I believe also in Nepal, they are integrated into the national legislation on the use, which at the parliamentary level and the constitutional level, around the evaluation and the accountability for public funding. And there the criteria are mentioned as well. I think we likely also have some of the colleagues that are attending this session may even have examples from their own country. Please do share those in the Q&A as well. We'd be interested to hear from that. Hear from you about that. But Siva, would you like to share any thoughts on, and also Xin Xin, on how the criteria are actually integrated into national legislation or national guidelines?
Yeah, now Sri Lanka had a national evaluation policy on country-led, country-owned national evaluation policy, which was approved by the Cabinet of Ministers. And now we are in the process of going towards an Act of Parliament. We are the National Evaluation Commission. There is a proposal from the members of the Parliament to establish a National Evaluation Commission, which will basically look at developing guidelines, developing evaluation plans, developing standards, ethics, and putting evaluation into a fair perspective, and making sure that the evaluations are fed into the parliamentary debates and discussions and policy debates and policy making process. So I think that act has been drafted and discussed at the Parliament. And on top of that, the USAID program also supported very recently in revising our practitioner's guide on development evaluation. We were able to revise our practitioner's guide last month, and I think we have conducted a Asian Evaluation Association. Through the Asian Evaluation Association, we conducted a webinar where the practitioner's guide was shared with all the Asian community, and it was quite well received. And they are very keen to have this practitioner's guide on a web platform, and we will be doing out that immediately as soon as we finalize. The big 6 criteria have been well articulated, though it was done in 2019 with the OECD, but still that has been fully blended into the practitioner's guide, and the guide focuses on the new development agenda, SDG focused new development agenda, and it already integrates in a very strong way the big six criteria. So therefore, in that context, Sri Lanka is going ahead. And also similarly, as you rightly said, other countries like Malaysia, India, Nepal, and even China, and also African countries, South Africa and all, they have their own systems, but still I have seen most of these documents, they have a lot of reference to the DAC evaluation criteria. So that shows that it has got into the ground reality, where the partner countries have started to strengthen their national evaluation systems, and the criteria are getting very strongly embedded, and the Big Six is going in a strong way with Coherence. I have recently done an evaluation of the evaluability of the LEADS program, where the Coherence criteria was a significant criteria that we used in the evaluation. So there are similar other things which I will, as you requested, I will share, so that it will be useful to the participants, as well as learning and sharing from others, our friends and colleagues.
Excellent, thank you. And another excellent question from MR Ba about the creating multi-partner approaches to evaluation. And I think, Xin Xin, you gave some good examples at the beginning about partnerships between the Dutch government and the Chinese government, for example. Could you share more on your thoughts about how a government-led approach and a multi-partner approach can be supported in evaluation?
Okay, sure. This is a very good question, and also we're going to see a very interesting example, which is the country-led evaluation that was co-conducted by the Dutch government as donor, and also the Chinese Chinese Evaluation Institute as the institution from recipient countries. So first, to the Chinese Evaluation Institute, this evaluation was both a capacity test and a capacity building experience. CLE, country-led evaluation, requires evaluation capacity at the country level. This exercise created a learning by doing opportunity for the Chinese evaluators to apply the concepts or methodologies to develop interventions in China in partnership with an experienced evaluation organization. According to the evaluation report, the Chinese Institute considerably improved its professional capacity during this exercise. It's the same case for the for IOB, for the Dutch Evaluation Institution, because this joint evaluation was a new experience in that it brought together two different evaluation cultures and systems. Moreover, this exercise was a timely pilot practice to advancing development evaluation in China. Like many other mid-income recipient countries of development funds, China was more explicitly considered responsible for their own development efforts and for the evaluation thereof than it has been in the past. So against this background, this exercise created an opportunity for China and its development partner to appreciate the difference in evaluation systems and cultures. And also this exercise demonstrated some challenges, in country-led evaluations. Yeah. Back to you, Megan.
Thank you so much, Xin Xin. And I've also shared a link to some other examples of country-led evaluation. I think this would be interesting to link to the question of the interconnection between external partners and national development actors. So, evaluation is part of the good governance of managing for sustainable development, either within a national context, local context, or within an international partnership. And so these criteria have actually been used also for South-South cooperation, and the arrangements for the evaluation often reflect the arrangements of the international partnership. So where you have, for example, multiple partners involved in implementing a program, you may have a government-led evaluation that's supporting evaluation of the effectiveness, and that's also looking critically at the role of the different external partners. But often that would need to be determined at the beginning of a project or a program, so that the evaluation could follow along with the approach to the overall sustainable development intervention. An interesting question here from Afsel: how do we capture the gap between program objectives and the aspirations of beneficiaries during evaluation? So I think this is about maybe a mismatch between what program objectives have been defined, perhaps without involving beneficiaries sufficiently. And so maybe the aspirations and the priorities of beneficiaries are not sufficiently reflected within the program objectives. How do we approach that as evaluators? Xin Xin, you feel free to come in, or Siva, if you'd like to come in.
I'm happy to share some thoughts on that. I think this is another good question. To me, to get the comments or feedback from any beneficiary is very important in evaluating the achievement or the result of an intervention. However, as an evaluator, you don't always have that opportunity to talk with these beneficiaries. It could be because you know, they are in remote area and they cannot reach you. You cannot travel to. It's too expensive for them to travel to you, or it's too hard for you to reach them. And also some of these opportunities are simply not arranged by the by either the host government or the implementing partners of the project. So first, it's very hard to get their feedback. However, once we have that opportunity, for me, it's always empowering opportunity for them to learn about what the objective of the interventions are and what they should expect out of these interventions, how to better understand their own situation and how to channel their voice to the decision makers. So yeah, I think that's a very important point, to take an empowering perspective when you interact with these people.
Excellent. Siva, do you have some thoughts on how do you approach the beneficiaries and also in setting the objectives of a program?
Yeah, I think it's very important because when the program objectives are not balanced towards the aspirations of the beneficiaries, I think there is something wrong with the planning process of the project. Project identification, project formulation, project appraisal process, there is something wrong. So a good project assessment or good project formulation should always consult with beneficiaries. There must be a closer consultation to identify what the beneficiaries require, what they want, what their needs are, what their priorities are, and then formulate projects in close collaboration and consultation with the participants. When a project is formulated on a top-down approach with a donor-centric, purely outside the country context, and also if it is highly centralized and prepared, then those projects may have gaps between the project objective and the aspirations of the beneficiaries. In today's context, we are all moving towards a participatory process, a participatory planning process, where we very closely consult with people and also consult with the communities and try to formulate projects. And also the sustainable development goals also emphasizes on localization and contextualization. You need to localize your SDGs. SDGs, though there are 17 goals in the SDGs, one may have to contextualize to his own context, to his own country, and also the provinces and districts. When it comes to subnational level, we may have to contextualize to our own subnational level also. So therefore, a very wide participatory consultation is important. Otherwise, you will not be able to evaluate a project when the two are different. When the beneficiary's objective is different from the program objective, you may evaluate it not perfectly in a correct way. Therefore, the OECD DPRK criteria, the new criteria, demands that the beneficiaries are taken care in the whole evaluation process. So their expectations, their thinking, what they want has to be factored in the program formulation and also in the program evaluation. Otherwise, the evaluation is sometimes considered to be a meaningful, completely beyond control evaluation. I think in that context, the DPRK criteria, the new criteria, is very strong on beneficiary involvement. I think we should follow the guidelines on those lines. That's my personal view.
Excellent. So we're getting close to wrapping up. I would just like to come back to some of our key messages, which is that the core concepts of these 6 criteria, relevance, coherence, effectiveness, efficiency, impact, and sustainability, are fixed. And even as we apply them and go about using them in a locally contextualized way, we maintain that conceptual clarity around these key ideas. Are we achieving our objectives? Will the impacts last? Are we doing the right things, and are we doing them well? Are we doing them efficiently and in a coherent way with other actors? And so what we're trying to emphasize today is really that there is a need to apply them in a local context, but that these basic core ideas captured within the evaluation criteria are really universal, and they can be applied within the Universal Agenda 2030 in a way that can support beneficiary involvement and empowering approach, and also bring together different stakeholders to use evaluation as a very powerful tool within our overall efforts to achieve sustainable development goals, as is all of our overall efforts. And you'll notice that we've named this document Better Criteria for Better Evaluation. And that is something that we really like to emphasize, that our goal is not simply to use these criteria, but to use the criteria in a way that creates high quality evaluations that will be very beneficial to our audiences, both in terms of improving the accountability of governments and also in improving our learning. So understanding what's driving the impacts that are being achieved or the unintended effects that are being caused by our interventions. So that's our key message for today. I'd like to hand it back to each of our panelists just to say one last word in closing, and let me turn it to you, Xin Xin, first to say your final words.
Well, thank you so much, Megan, and also thank you, Siva. It's a great pleasure, and also thank you to the audience for raising these thoughtful questions for us to have this interesting and in-depth discussion. I just hope that the availability of the Chinese translation of OECD DAC revised evaluation criteria will be useful for the many audience in China, many including universities, organizations and individuals, and will promote the utilization of these criteria to the next stage. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Siva. One last word. Thank you so much, Xin Xin, for your contributions. Siva, any last comments from your side?
I think that as Megan, very pleased to work with Megan and Xin and all the colleagues. It was a very interesting exercise, and we sharing and learning is very important, and we are very pleased with the work, the discussions we had. And also on top of all these things, I think countries will have to strongly make sure that these big 6 criteria are well practiced and institutionalized, put into practice, and relevant capacity building efforts are also given, because all these 6 criteria have definitional changes. Though we may call it 6, but there are certain hidden, very insightful informations are there. So one may have to have some capacity building programs for the practitioners, participants, which will throw a lot of lessons and insights. And I hope OECD, DAC and other donor community will take this forward. And also in developing such criteria, also the partner countries also should have a very strong say in the whole process, because today evaluation is becoming a more of a national evaluation system rather than a donor-centric evaluation process. So the country-based, country-led evaluations are getting rooted. Therefore, I think that process, the donors will have to recognize, and also development partners, today not donors, but more of a development partners, that participation and partnerships are very important. And I think that criteria are in that sense very useful, and there are a lot of lessons, and we will have to take this forward everywhere. And even in our universities, currently we are teaching these new criteria. So academically also capacity building is taking place in University of Columbus, University of Jayawardhanapura, Evaluation Center, Postgraduate Institute of Management. At the master's degree, we have special evaluation modules where training and capacity building is being done on evaluation. Thank you very much, Megan and Xin. It was enjoyable, and it was nice to working with both of you.
Thank you so much. And we will be sharing the PowerPoint. I'm sorry we didn't get to the last question about measuring impact, but I think if you look into Siva's section of the evaluation matrices, he described the use of different indicators around the evaluation questions. And I think that will give you some clues around looking at impacts and looking all the way along the results chain during the implementation. And just one final word, thank you all for joining us, and one final word of thanks to our hosts and to the colleagues at ADB for doing such an excellent job on the technical platform and making it possible for us all to be together virtually today. Thank you and have a lovely evening, a lovely day for those of you just starting off your day. Goodbye.
Goodbye.